We got a character, we got a boss fight, and we got a plan. Now the scary part, actually delivering on that plan and making the first set of rooms for my game. As I mentioned in the previous devlog, I'll be making the game one vertical slice at a time. So one weapon, boss and level as a set. Before I move on to the next weapon, boss and level. The idea being is that if I run into any major issues in designing the levels, I'll be able to fix them early on rather than having to remake the whole game. Figuring out I need to change a mechanic and rendering half my levels broken. And so far that seems to have worked out, because even in just creating these tutorial levels, I've had to add a ledge grabbing mechanic, as well as move some of the code around to different classes to be a little bit more design friendly. Imagine if I didn't know you could grab ledges until I'd already designed half my levels. Any sense of platforming would need to be remade, as well as having to go through and see if my current levels have any places that can be abused with this ledge grabbing. I don't want to pull a Mario 64 and leave in something as broken as a backwards long jump after all. Anyway, level design. As before, I started out sketching basic IDs in Photoshop on a map, so I could make sure that A, I have my IDs documented, and B, more importantly, the levels actually make some sort of spatial sense. Of course, in reality, they don't really have to, but when you exit a room on the right, you want to enter the next room on the left, and so on. This will become much more important once the rooms stop being so linear. In this tutorial, you just go from one room into the next, and to the next, and into the next, but in the main game, every room will probably have 3 or 4 doors that you can go through, and without having a visual guide to reference when designing, that's gonna be a nightmare for me. So the rooms I have set up in the tutorial are the first opening map. This just needs to look mysterious and pretty. I spent way too much time creating the grass you see here, but damn, it looks so good. My GPU isn't a huge fan of rendering this much grass, and my frame rate drops from well over 100 to below 60 when I'm looking at this grassy hill, so maybe that needs a little bit of work. Next we have the movement tutorial. This is just a room with a couple of blocks set up to let the player get a feel for the movement. Jumping, the new ledge grabbing mechanic, and the dashing move, which is useful for platforming but will also end up being relevant as a combat mechanic. Once you've reached up to the tallest block and pick up the XP orb, a bridge on the other side of the map will lower down, letting you pass through to the next spot. Of course, you could always use a well-timed mid-air dash to skip past this bridge, but if you can do that, you know the mechanics of the game well enough to skip this part of the movement tutorial, plus you're choosing to leave behind a useful amount of XP. This is something that you'll probably see more often with my design. I'm not afraid to let players pull a sequence break like this. It's only a small skip, and every playthrough has to include this tutorial. So letting players skip the more boring parts of it when they already have a feel for the mechanics, and giving the player the freedom to do what they want when they want it, is key to making a fun game. If I wanted to hold their hand and deliver them a very strictly curated experience, I'd be making a movie, not a game. Anyway, I digress. Next up we have some combat tutorials. This is just one single enemy walking around. It's been modified to only deal 1 damage, so that it is very, very forgiving. Striking a balance between teaching the player that this is an enemy, it attacks, it hurts, but not having the player die if they don't get it right away. Once this enemy dies, another bridge lowers. This one is harder, but still possible to skip with some well-timed dashes. But before you can make it through the next door into the next part of the level, comes the first tutorial that you can't actually skip, to my knowledge anyway. Deflecting projectiles. While this is not the first game to introduce a mechanic like this, any person playing this game will probably instantly realize how the movement and combat mechanics work. This needs a little bit more attention though, as it'll be a very important part in fighting certain enemies, and possibly getting involved in some puzzles in the future as well. So here you just need to hit back 3 projectiles being shot at you to unlock the door. 3 because, well, it's a nice number, but I also think that 3 iterations of a lesson is exactly right for teaching the player something. If they do it once, it could be an accident. If they've done it twice, they will likely understand what they need to do, but if you let them do it 3 times, they get enough room to get comfortable with the mechanic. This is pretty much the whole level design philosophy behind the new Super Mario Bros. Series. In reality, almost every level in that game is just a lengthy tutorial for the mechanic that that specific stage introduces, teaching in a safe environment, letting you get familiar, and finally testing you on it. Of course, this is just hitting 3 glowing balls and a lot less sophisticated, but the same principles still apply. Going in the next room, you'll see an enemy spawner. It'll spawn 3 waves of enemies, and then, once it's finished, turn into a checkpoint. There's nothing much to discuss here. You'll learn how enemy spawning works in the game, as well as learning about checkpoints, which heal you up, and also let you level up your stats. And on top of that, they also work as the respawn point for when you die. The next 2 rooms simply combine these aspects. They're filled with enemy spawners and some basic platforming. These are the first real levels of the game that exist to let you go through a challenge rather than trying to teach you something. Then we finally have a room that starts with a single enemy spawner, but when that one is out of enemy waves, it activates the next enemy spawner, and then another one, and so on and so forth, until you've gone through all these spawners in the room, and you get to unlock the checkpoints before the boss fight. Which, if you want to know more about the boss fight, there's a whole separate video on that topic. This room is here to make sure that you have a really good feel for the combat. You likely won't make it through unless you understand at least somewhat what you're doing. It's still not super difficult, of course, it's still part of the tutorial, but this is the first time you have to fight for an extended amount of time to progress beyond just clearing out that single spawner. Well, once all that was sketched out, I spent about a week or so blocking out all these levels in Unity, coding the doors between the levels and changing how my checkpoint system works to support going between different scenes, which was a little bit of a pain, to be honest. Then I threw some quick, mostly temporary, materials in and added a bunch of fog and some lighting, and suddenly we have a game. Some rooms are still rather empty, so I added some decorative rocks. I think we might have a demo. Well, not quite yet. I realized that one type of enemy per boss domain is getting really stale really quickly. And while I've been improving the combat in the background over the last few devlogs, and even if I were to add more enemies, you're still doing the same 3 hits all the time. So, as much as I didn't think I was gonna do this, it looks like it's time to look into a at least semi-proximity based combat system. I have to work out some ideas for it, but you can bet that the next devlog will be all about taking the combat from functional to being fun. And a very big thank you to all of my Patreons. You can see them on screen right now. If you want to help out supporting the channel, there's a link down below in the description to the Patreon page.